Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program. Jodi, thanks for taking some time to join me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Owen.
It's going to be fun. We're going to talk about gold, the business you built. We're going to talk about all different things as they relate to technology, financial services, and you've got a wealth of experience in many different disciplines. But I like to start with a few, short answer questions. And one of them comes from a previous interview that you did. And in that, you were asked to pick one investment. And you said something that I've never seen or heard before. So I thought I'd have to bring it up. Your response was an unlisted organic farm. This was an investment that you'd have to make for 10 years. And I'm just curious why.
Well, the key question is you have to hold for 10 years, right? So that drove. So look, our planet is exploding in terms of population. We've gone from 6 to 8 billion in the last 25 years. The next 25 years, we're going to be at 10. So I think one of the biggest problems we face is feeding ourselves over the next century. And the more chemicals we put in our food and the more that we genetically modify, I think the organic nature of food is more precious every year. At least it is for me. And so I think for me to own a healthy organic farm is going to be of high value moving forward. Now, why though private versus a public company? Again, it goes back to the nature of the question being long-term, 10 years. And if you have to hold a company for the long term, you want that company to address the long-term, value gain. And in a listed company, you have, the risk of the markets right now. The entire market is down. And on top of that, you have very much short-term goals. You have short-term profit milestones. You think very differently, I think. Politics are very similar, right? You're in there for a period of time, and you won't be there in 10 years' time. So you make decisions that reflect that, and I think CEOs of listed companies make decisions to reflect that as well, and that can get in the way of a truly sustainable long-term company sometimes, and many times.
That alignment of incentives is so important. And I think it's no secret now how big private markets have become from a funding perspective, maybe partly to solve that challenge for a lot of business owners and management teams that do indeed want to think long term, but can't for all of the reasons you just laid out. Yeah. And it's very close to home too, the organic farm. I remember when I was growing up, my mum would only ever feed me organic food for that very reason. Maybe she was ahead of her time. I'm over 30 now, I can say. So it was quite some time ago. But Jodi, I do have another question that relates to something that you answered in the past. And that is, I heard someone once say that privacy is an illusion in our modern world. And it's this idea that, we've heard of all these breaches and hacks and identity theft and things just in the last year here in Australia. This is going on for a very long time. I think the key thing is for me, those are the ones that we know about. Those are the few that we know about. Why would a company self-report things if they didn't have to, right? So I'm curious to understand the greatest threat or threats that you see from technology.
Well, there are two as I see them. One is the lack of local community. You can get I used to call my mother for a recipe. Now I look it up on Pinterest. I have my iPad in my kitchen ready to go. How to get a stain, red wine stain out of a white shirt. I used to call my mom, but I don't need to. And I think that sense of local community. And I've spent, you go to small towns in Europe, there still is that community. You find 9-year-olds riding their 90-year-olds riding their bicycles around, visiting each other. In Turkey, everyone's sitting there drinking chai, and the old men are, sit there all afternoon. And I think, if I look down on the street right now, everybody's just staring at their phone, right? And nobody really needs that information share, but we sure need the connection. And I think that's a real pity. The other one is privacy, as you say, right? No surprise there. Even if you look at cryptocurrencies and how excited everyone is, and the thought of removing the middleman and being able to transact direct peer-to-peer outside of the banking system, and that's all wonderful. But blockchain itself, could it be that the private sector has just subsidized one of the greatest control vehicles that we've known in our lifetime? And governments, if they could now move us to an entirely cashless community with, being able to track and tax every transaction that we do, and we're progressing that in cryptocurrencies. And so there's a lot of good about cryptocurrencies too. But I think on the topic of privacy, I think you could be careful what you wish for. I think.
That's fascinating, because I won't get into the politics or the belief system around some of the blockchain technology, but I think that would probably be the opposite of what people tell me.
That's the irony.
Yeah.
That's the irony. It's the trustless system, and we can do everything on our own. But I think, regulation will come in, and governments need the right to tax, right? They need the right to tax. That's how nations are run. And so they will fight tooth and nail to make sure that happens. And if that's, transactions are moving outside of the financial system, they're going to make sure that they're part of that. And hence, and they make the rules. So it's a tricky one. It's a complex one, and probably can go well beyond the scope of this discussion. But
we could be here.
We could be here all day. But it's a very complex matter and very complex technology, and where this could all go. On one hand, it's very exciting, and on the other hand, it scares me to death where it could go.
Interesting. So. I hadn't thought of that perspective, so that's really true. We might come back to that. But your background is very varied. So you were saying off air before when you came to Australia, and I've heard different interviews with you in the past, and you've spoken about going around the world and doing all sorts of things in investment and financial services, from investment banking and venture capital, and now you have Rush. But I'm curious, given your career, I thought I'd maybe break it down to just a pretty simple question, which is, which of the experiences stand out to you as having an impact on the way you either invest or the way you run a business today, or both?
I'd love to give you a simple answer to that, Owen, but the answer really is everything together. They're all correlated. I'll break it down though. I think, the way I think about it in my own mind is that I've benefited from transacting at the top end of town and at the bottom end of town, the smaller end of town. And so, yes, I have, experience. I was a financial engineer on Wall Street. I was an actuary in insurance companies. I learned how to do things professionally. I was a consultant for a consulting firm, and I learned how to, do project finance by putting together a detailed business plan. I learned how to do NPV. I learned about the time value of money. I learned about the professional governance, risk management, and setting up committees. Matching assets and liabilities, and doing all that in a team environment and in under an overlay of compliance and legal and all of that. Now, and at the same time, I've been an entrepreneur for many years. So when I think I was 13 when I started making teddy bears and selling at school, which turned into an upholstery. I used to reupholster deck furniture and design, porches and sunrooms for homes. I think I was doing that when I was 15. By 18. I was making wedding gowns. Then I made tents and sleeping bags. I
Wow.
made and sold whatever I could and taught myself everything along the way. And yes, all that was, I put a business plan together to even travel and raise some money for that. I started a whitewater raft company when I was 21 and sold that. So I've done a lot of things and learned so much along the way. And I think that having that balance and having that both ends of town is put together is probably my biggest education. Because I think if you did one, if you just deal in the small end of town, you don't think big. And if you just operate in the big end of town, you don't really know how to be resourceful and roll your sleeves up and just get things done. And, everyone in our business puts paper in the copy machine when it's empty. It's nobody's pigeonholed into a particular role. So we all do everything, and it's a very flat organization. And so everyone is very resourceful. So I think it is both. But I've also, if you think of venture capital, I've spent time in venture capital, both the US and Australia. And I think you learn a lot what goes wrong. I am certainly from my Wall Street days, certainly a student of Charlie Munger's mental models, hundreds of them, and at one point I was taught to learn them all. And so I think it's just that collection. The wisdom of crowds is another one. Learning the importance of wisdom of crowds. I mean, you can put together a team of experts on a matter and get to an answer that is not as good as getting to an answer by putting people from varied experiences, assuming they're all non-correlated, right? And so you have someone who was a former CEO of HSBC, but you also have someone who makes bridal gowns, right? And to pull in that together and get to an investment decision based on everybody's collective anecdotal experience. And I think that's really powerful and to make sure everybody's heard, because everybody has a viewpoint that could make you money, in the topic of investing here. Everybody has a viewpoint or an experience that could help make you money in a way that you hadn't thought of before. So I think it's just that balance of, the big and the small end of town. And I guess it's unique, I think, in some ways. It's
Absolutely.
Becoming less unique, by the way. But, I mean, my father ended up, he spent 36 years in the same job, right? So those days are gone. And when I spent some time last week with a senior executive of one of the major banks here one afternoon last week. And his comment was, there's nobody, all the good young people are going into technology, going into engineering. They're not going up through the financial institutions like they used to. So there's not that talent. The talent is not coming up through some of those institutions like they did before. And I think that's changing the landscape of the financial system greatly. I think
maybe it plays to your advantage, though.
I think so.
In a previous interview, you mentioned something where you said you felt partly responsible. Now, I wasn't just 100% sure of the context around this. Actually, and before I get to this question, I am quite amazed that you said all of those things that you did before 21. People would probably be happy with that over a lifetime.
Well, I'm only 23 now.
Yeah,
so,
that's it. Yeah. I just thought that's incredible. But you said in a previous discussion that you felt partly responsible. And I think this was around the collapse of long-term capital management, if I'm not mistaken. So are you able to talk about the impact that had on you?
Look, I was at the time in risk management in a boutique risk management firm on Wall Street, and with plans to stay in Wall Street for a period of time. And I think that, along with a few other things that happened, a few other decisions that I made at the time, that's when I decided, quite frankly, to come to Australia.
Oh, right.
So it wasn't long-term capital explicitly. However, I was, going to dinners in a town car on, every Thursday in the trade towers and listening to some of these guys. I won't list names, but they're household names you can talk about. And everyone's patting themselves on the back. I was a youngster at the time, but there's a lot of money floating around. And this is at the end of the booms or in the bull markets, right? So the tail end of it. But still, it was, I think, even the godfathers of financial engineering, derivatives, who were behind long-term capital, even they did not quite anticipate the domino effect that they had on some of their investment decisions. And I think we just all felt that the financial system was solid, right? And I think when I say I was responsible, I certainly am not taking the fall of long-term capital, but I think as a little puncher back then, but I think it made me think really hard about what I wanted to do for a living. And I think, as investors, as entrepreneurs, I think we all have great power in how we spend our time and our resources. Mm-hmm. And back then I looked at what I was doing and I was going to court and we were talking about a particular trade. We had to develop a view on whether the trade was a reverse repo, a double interest rate swap. Who was going to write who a check? Was it Goldman Sachs that was out $500 million, or was it JP Morgan? Who? And people didn't know. And the fact that they didn't know was horrifying. Because you had, millions of people in Middle America with 401ks that, their decision was a big deal. And this all unraveled. And so when I say I was doing what led to the GFC, I was in that sector, I suppose. And that was when I looked at where I would be heading and how much money I could be making, and that's why, yes, I took a pretty big pay cut when I came to Australia and left finance and left Wall Street. But I think I did it for the right reasons. And I just didn't want to be a part of that game anymore, gambling with people's money. I do have a propensity to for adventure sports, I suppose.
Hence the whitewater rafting.
And a few other things, right? So, yes, my biggest hobby for a long time was mountain climbing. So I grew up ice climbing, and that was my thing. Instead of skiing, we were always ice climbing. So I knew I went to see quite a few doctors because of that. I remember starting out, the doctors knew everything. And then my brother became a doctor. And then a few more family members became doctors. And I looked around like, well, hold on. That's just my brother, right? He doesn't know everything. And so I kind of learned the hard way that, and then I had a doctor literally make a mistake in a surgery that I had. And so I learned that they don't know everything and they're not infallible. When I was at Wall Street, as a witness to some of this that was going on, and from the inside out, quite frankly, it was a big lesson to learn that the financial system isn't infallible either. And the minute I learned that was like, it changed my life. The financial system is not infallible. It can fail. When you hold money in a bank, there is an external party that guarantees, right, $250,000. But it is a claim. They have, it's a promise for them to pay you that back when you need it, but it's actually not your money anymore. And learning those concepts, learning the time value of money, that in my lifetime, the dollar has lost 80% of its purchasing power. So due to inflation. And those concepts were not lost on me, and they hit me like a ton of bricks. And so, yeah, I left Wall Street. I didn't want to be a part of that. And I think I walked away with some pretty big lessons that, look around. You need to, we need to be careful here. We need to be careful. We're messing with our livelihood globally. I'm going to follow up on this. Did you think because you had studied actuarial science and gone into that field that you thought because that is often held as like the pinnacle in terms of financial mathematics or financial engineering. Did you think, well, maybe this is like the medicine of finance, right? And I thought they would have the answers. Is that what you thought? That's the parallel I saw certainly between the medical profession and learning that they're not infallible, and the financial system equally is not infallible. And they were parallels in my own mind at a very young age. And I guess I've never looked back. I think where it really struck home is when I left Wall Street as a result of this and jumped on a lifelong dream. I wanted to ride my bike around the globe. And so I wrote a business plan, got Trek to sponsor and a few others to sponsor my trip. And,
oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I spent a year in business plan mode, 10 hours a day, every day for 18 months. And it wasn't a holiday. It was a goal. It was a quest. And, 18 months, I ended back in the States. And in so doing, though, I guess, I talked about the top end of town and the bottom end of town. Now I'll just say, now I have experience through that bicycle trip for 18 months at the tiny end of town, at the unfortunate, at the poverty end of town. It's a whole nother level down, and it's where most of the world lives. And for me, there was a correlation. I'm going off track here, but there was a real correlation with wealth and gratitude. And, going back to Wall Street after this bicycle trip, it was, it's truly, I said no more, right? It's not for me. And people were gracious and generous and, eating dalbat in the dark, in the dirt after, riding through the foothills of the Himalayas. And people who had nothing would give you their last clean water for the day, right? And then you go back to Wall Street and it's, eight martinis lined up because they'd ordered so many and they're passed out on the table. I've been there. I've watched that happen. And no sense of, you just have to hit them and try to get their credit card out of their pocket at the end of the day. This is a banker, right? That took us to dinner. It's just crazy stuff that went on back in the day. And for me, there's a wealth gap and it's growing. And what do we do about it? And so going back to that comment about where we have a lot of power in how we spend our time and our resources, for me, it's like I wanted to be on the asset side of the balance sheet after that. I wanted to put an asset in the hands of people who didn't have an asset. And we started out thinking we could do that en masse outside of the banking system and even outside of cash. So how do we approach that? Well, what we learned is that we cannot build a business being altruistic forever. You have to make a profit, right? And so we, in our business now is very much a high net worth product, but it is accessible to everyone. You can buy $1 of gold, right? So for us, but it's that wealth gap. It's about operating in the asset side rather than the debt. I mean, you can get debt everywhere. There's been fintechs all around the world who have made a boatload of money through the debt side of the balance sheet. But we were adamant. We wanted to build an asset. It's that back to that organic farm. Let's go to something real. Let's get rid of counterparty risk. We have GFC Mark II. We did have COVID, but every time we're in a crisis, we print more money. Every time we print more money, we devalue our money. Every time you devalue money, you have to look around for something that is going to hold its value. And that's where, we got to gold because it does just that.
There's so many things that I could pull out of that. So if I'm not mistaken, it was around about 2016 that you decided to launch Rush, if I'm not mistaken. And originally, if I'm not mistaken, it was called Send Gold. Was that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. This origin story of a business is actually it sounds like you did lay the foundations for us just fantastically right there. But what made you want to, what prompted you to be like, okay, I'm going to do something about it? That's kind of like my first thing. But the second thing is how did you initially go about it? So you mentioned you need something that's real. Then how did you join the dots to, I'm the one to do this and here's how I'm going to do it?
Well, I was in venture capital at the time and I was seeing a lot in the space of blockchain. That's how it started, quite frankly. And so this concept of wanting to not follow everyone else and go down and do something on the debt side. And yes, as an entrepreneur, you obviously have done a few different things. Entrepreneurs are always thinking and trying to figure out what are the problems, how can you solve it. But for me, it was really about initially about the wealth gap, because the top end of town knows how to buy gold. They know how to buy any asset they want, right? It's me who needs help, right? It's those of us who don't have a whole office of people investing my money, right? And so we looked at it in that regard, and blockchain was really interesting because we said, okay, there's demand for a vehicle to transfer money offshore. There's a vehicle for peer-to-peer transfer that is may or may not be known to someone else, that may or may not be taxed, right? Something that's completely outside the banking system, something that settles instantly cross-border. Bitcoin did all of these things and more. So for me, someone who studied cryptography, someone who spent their career in financial services and technology, all my Christmases came at once. And I said, this is really cool. And started looking at Bitcoin in particular. So I met many miners. Now Bitcoin copied what, the scarcity, is copying the scarcity of gold, for example, in that the mining process mimics mining gold. It's, most of the gold is already mined. And it is, hard to store and audit and capture and access and all of those things, and getting harder and harder to mine over time, such as Bitcoin. So I was the one buying Bitcoin with $30,000 at a time in brown paper bags. And I would meet someone at a cafe and they'd say, okay, I'm the guy with a yellow DHL bag on the table. Just come by and leave your money and I'll transfer you the Bitcoin. And I was like, no. I don't know who you normally sell Bitcoin to, but I'm on the up and up here. Let's sit down and I want to learn everything that you know. And so this is what I did for a year. We also, our first opportunity we thought we would build is a crypto exchange. And then we realized that by developing a crypto exchange, you are actually making redundant the entire decentralized component of Bitcoin or blockchain. And it's in itself, at the core, it is about a decentralized finance system. And by setting up an exchange, you're actually putting a middleman in the middle again and wiping the whole concept out. So it's a bit redundant. So we didn't do that. And then we said, okay, let's keep all the things that we really like about Bitcoin and let's fix all the things that we don't like about Bitcoin and see what we come up with. And initially we did a basket of assets that would maintain global purchasing power, the next GFC Mark II. But we ended up with gold. And because gold, you can actually buy direct title. Counterparty risk will continue to be a problem over time, right? With an ETF, you own a share in a fund, you don't own the gold directly. And so if something happens like MF Global, you ended up getting 70 cents on the dollar when they went bankrupt. So there is that counterparty risk. So we said, okay, but if you directly own title to the gold, you do not own a share or a fund, you own the gold, the underlying gold. And with that, what can we do with it? And so that's how we ended up with, we called it Send Gold because we were having a conversation and we wrote it, speaking about writing something on a napkin. We just said, okay, here it is. And we did the logo and then we said, let's just see if it has any legs. So we didn't spend any more time on branding and,
build the product.
We built a product. And then we became the first guys to be able to sell gold real time when you spend through MasterCard. So with Apple Pay, Google Pay, and Samsung Pay, you can add Rush to your wallet and you can actually spend gold real time. And at which time we're actually doing a trade on your behalf in the background. So we are, I believe, could still be the only ones, but we're certainly the first to be able to spend gold from those major mobile wallets. And in so doing, at that point, we changed our name to Rush. Rush Gold, and now we're about to launch another asset, which I'll talk about another time. But we're changing it to Rush. It's just in short, Rush.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so here's my version of what you just said, and then you tell me what you would say if someone came up to you at a barbecue or a cocktail party. But it seems to me that someone could use the Rush app to store gold that they have direct title to. They could send it or receive it, kind of like you would with a blockchain wallet or something like that. But you can also just hold it, or you can pay with it. So because of the link with MasterCard, you could go to the coffee shop and pay for your cappuccino knowing that it's backed by gold. Is that correct? How do you describe it?
Look, I think, Oxford Economics they did a recent report where they said, okay, how much gold should you hold? And they said somewhere between 10 and 15. And I'll touch on that again later. But if that's the case, and you look around and you say, okay, well, I've got a $100,000 portfolio. I want between $10,000 and $15,000 worth of gold. Where do I buy that? Do I even know how? Rush is simply an easy way to buy direct title to gold with no counterparty on an app in a few minutes, right? You have to go through AML, KYC. You have to go through an onboarding process. But now once you have direct title, so we're a premium product to an ETF. So if you think of an ETF, you do not own the gold. So it's a premium product to an ETF, but at the same time, it's lower cost. So ETF has holding costs every year. They have brokerage fees as well. But over time, those annual fees add up because they're paying all the middlemen, right? The middlemen have to make money. So you've got custodian, you've got sub-custodians, and so they must be paid. Now, so once you have the premium product, you have direct title to gold, you can do many things with it. I can buy it, I can hold it, I can sell it, I can send it as a gift. We're opening up gift registries. So you could say, I'm getting married. Here's my son's birthday. We're opening youth accounts. So there's a lot that you can do with the gold now and more so in the coming year that you just can't do with a dumb bar in a vault, right? So very simply put, you can buy it simply, quickly, and transfer it and spend it. You can open up a MasterCard. It's direct debit and add it to your Apple Wallet. And away you go. So it's got the utility and it's got the 24/7 liquidity. And that's unique in the market and pretty exciting to people who get the value of direct title.
So I got a lot of questions around this, but the first is, what does direct title actually mean? So does that mean that you link the user of Rush directly to something in a vault? Is that what it means?
Correct. So you don't own it through a fund. You don't own it through. So there's different ways to own exposure to the gold price. An ETF clearly is one of them. But as I made mention, you don't own the gold, right? Someone else does. And maybe many people do between you and the gold. And in the case of an ETF, it may be 100% backed by gold. It may be 60% backed by gold. So ETFs were great because it solved for the ability, you have to insure, you have to audit it, you have to do all of these things for gold. You have to store it in a vault, men with guns, maybe in women, I don't know, but there's a lot to do when you have talking about physical gold rather than paper. Someone has to kind of pay for that, right? So it does get tricky. ETFs say, okay, well, we don't want to mess with all that. But what we've done is kind of the next evolution of an ETF in some regards, in that you do have direct title, but you don't have all of those things that you need to do. So we store in Sydney and Brisbane vaults. We're insured. Your gold is insured by Lloyd's of London, physically audited by Bureau Veritas, and we don't yet allow you to come and see your gold unless you own over a certain amount. But you are the difference between allocated and unallocated gold is that unallocated gold, you basically someone owes you the price of gold, whereas allocated gold, which is what we sell, you own the gold directly. So we can identify exactly what you own at any given time. So it's a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of elements to it.
No, that makes sense.
But bottom line is, I can tell you what gold you own.
And I know because I've done some prep for this interview, but how does the fee structure work? So someone that buys gold through you versus, we know with an ETF with its holding costs and there's brokerage costs as well. How does it work with Rush?
We have a 1% transaction fee, which is like a brokerage cost, capped at $90. So if you're buying, $1,000 worth of gold, it'll be 1%. But if you're buying a larger amount of gold, then it is capped at that $90. So depending on how much you want to buy, it's a pretty low, becomes a pretty low fee very quickly. That 1% is capped.
Do you find most people buy to hold?
Absolutely. And that's where those ongoing holding fees can add up, right? Yeah. So, 15 years out, you're talking 10 times the price. Read the prospectus. I mean, there's lots, I'm not saying you should own gold one way or the other, but if you are going to, any financial product, you need to read the prospectus, because I think people forget or don't appreciate that these fees add up over time. And what seems like a good deal going in is maybe not after a couple of years. So if you are buying to hold, you need to look at those ongoing costs.
For sure. Okay. So, and just to confirm with the MasterCard, so you could you go overseas with it?
Yes. Anywhere in the world that MasterCard is accepted.
Right. Because I think it was, I'm pretty sure it was you, Jodi, who said that in a previous discussion, you said something like the purchasing power is one of the greatest risks that people don't actually pay attention to. Right. And when I got to know you and we exchanged some emails and what have you, I started to think about this a bit more, in that this idea of like purchasing power and gold holding its value versus cash in the bank. I don't know if you can see where I'm going. It's kind of like off the reserve here a bit.
Well, again, in my lifetime, we've lost 80% of our value of the dollar. Okay. And that's probably your lifetime too, or somewhere in the middle of it. My lifetime's far longer than yours. But I think that's through inflation. The dollar does not hold its value. It's just that basic concept of the time value of money. It's worth less. You can pick up an old restaurant menu and find, a cup of coffee was 20 cents, right? So, well, it's $6 today, at least the one I drink. So, that's what's happening with our money. Now, if you look at gold, it cost a certain amount of gold to buy a suit back in the days of the pharaohs. It costs the same amount of gold to buy a suit today, exact same weight of gold. The price of gold is very much dictated by our confidence in the financial system. And I think over time, we worry about that and the stability of the financial system, which, I've touched on. And there's a lot of things that impact the price of gold. But bottom line is, it all impacts the price of gold. And so if you look at gold is an all-time high right now. And yet when gold hits that $2,000 US mark, it's going to blow through it and that will become a floor, like any asset, right? It's hitting its head as a ceiling right now, but it will become the floor. It has gone over 2,000 quite a bit in the last few weeks. And the bigger banks are expecting it to blow that away in the coming months and years. I'm not going to comment too much on the price of gold. I know that I buy it whenever it dips. But when I was 18, I bought Berkshire Hathaway and gold, and I never looked back. They both served me really well as a bedrock foundation for my portfolio, and I've never sold either one.
Really? You bought Berkshire alongside gold, which is quite an interesting one, because...
Well, I knew he wasn't going to... Warren Buffett's not going to buy gold, right?
Yeah, so, that's it. Well, that's
although he did.
Yeah. He bought if I'm not mistaken, Barrick Gold.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so because this is going to air on our business podcast as well, I do have a couple of questions about the business side of Rush. And there are two parts to this. The one is what were the technical hurdles you had to overcome to build something like this? Because you're matching a physical asset with a financial technology company and financial services. So it's kind of blending it all together. So I'm curious, what were the kind of the big rocks that you had to do? One of the first things I asked the Rush team was, like, what's the regulatory environment like? How are you guys, audited, checks and balances and all that? And I've since discovered there's many hurdles you had to overcome there. So I'm curious how you would comment on that.
Well, it hasn't been, it's not an MVP was probably on steroids. So there's a lot we had to pull together. I think like any modern day business, technology is never the hard part. Technology is less and less a barrier every day. So what we very much looked at the buy versus build. So the first number one thing we did was we said, okay, let's look at buy versus build, and how much of this do we really want to own as an asset, and how much do we need to plug in? So we took we have taken a open API platform approach to what we do, and with that we've grown now to multi-asset, so self-managed super funds, businesses, and now youth. Not youth today, but new youth about to come out, and multi-asset. We're about to launch a new asset. It was really easily done. We have a couple different channels to market, which we can talk about that in a minute. But we very much took a platform approach, which means we can scale quite a bit quickly, easily, when and if the time is right to turn these all on. So but we also built on other people's shoulders. Like we plugged in the components that we felt were commodity. And so we have an underlying mobile bank grade system under our platform. We didn't go and build that. Someone else did for about $100 million. We negotiated an amazing partnership with them, and we're off and running. So we were very decisive about what we built versus, respecting that you have to stick to your knitting, and you have to know what you want to spend your time and resources on. So for us, our team is fairly senior, and we're in technology, and we're in financial services. So we took a very much a non-technology approach to what we're doing. We do have 2 Australian financial services licenses. We are fully AML compliant. We've had 2 independent audits for AML successful over the last few years. So we punch above our weight. We're not required to do all of that. We have a really good fraud system. We have, I think our fraud losses are 0.00074% of our transaction volume.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is. So we've built our MVP, if you will, with the sledgehammer, so to speak. So we're ready to rock and roll. The challenges were really about constantly being best in breed in everything we did, because to allow for Apple to allow us on their platform, you have to tick a lot of boxes. You had to go through a lot of hoops. But because we'd already done that with PayPal, we opened up we can operate in 90 currencies with PayPal. They were our first banking partner. So there are a lot of things that we did right from the start, which made the rest of it a little bit easier. AML, for example, with a sledgehammer approach, we have a private letter from them around what we're doing. We wanted to make sure that they didn't change the laws and come back and haunt us later. Because we deal with direct title, that opens up a lot of doors for us. To be honest, we're not a security, and so that's a really important distinction. So I think there's always another challenge. You can always do better. There's always new opportunities. There's always customers that introduce new ideas and ask for new things. But I think we've maintained, our directors we have a VIP service, right? So our directors manage that, myself included. So we are still very much about solving people's real problems, and rather than just let the technology do it themselves. So we're quite an evolving company, if you will, and we've got more work ahead of us than behind us. But we've got a platform that is highly, highly scalable. We've got customers in 15 countries. We have, I made mention that we have 2 channels to market. We have an app. But we also have, a channel where we can embed our service into third-party channels. So a bank or a wealth manager. And so we've got some pretty interesting projects around the globe. Some we've plugged in and are operating. Some we're in the progress of signing and developing. So we have a nice pipeline of third parties who want to.
Because that's really interesting. That because I heard it's a bit of a buzzword play, gold as a service, but it really was interesting to me. So you built it so that your core platform can plug into like a rewards program or gifts and whatever.
Yeah, so I hate to use the word bank, but if you think of us as an open API bank, but with gold, that's that describes that, I think. So we're able to plug and play pretty quickly, particularly because we're not a security, and we tick all the boxes with compliance. So if a wealth manager wanted to sell direct title to gold right now, as a wealth manager, they don't make fees from someone that goes to somewhere and buys gold, right? That's out of their jurisdiction, so to speak. But if they plug our gold in, they can then, be a part of that and add that gold to their overall portfolio in a way that they've not been able to do before. And particularly that's interesting offshore. We've had a lot of interest offshore, inbound interest. We don't even market it. So it comes to us. And we've got a really big Middle East project going on right now. It's not launched, but we're very excited about that. So, but zero acquisition cost for us from a business perspective. So it's very exciting.
I'd like to shift gears now from like kind of the built and the platform that you manage to gold as like the kind of the asset class that I know a lot of our listeners will be thinking about, right? Is like if they do have that 10%, 15%, whatever they've got, 5% in their portfolios, they'll be thinking about this, right? They'll be thinking, well, how can I think about getting exposure, how much, and so on and so forth. But you mentioned before that there are multiple variables that do drive the gold price. But I'm curious because it also ties in with this idea of so much money in circulation these days. Would it be fair to say, or how would you think about this if I said that the US dollar, so at the greenback, the reserve currency drives a lot of what we see in the gold price? Would that be a fair statement, do you think, or would you disagree, or is there nuance there?
Yes, but it's bigger than that. It is bigger than that. So gold plays such a big part. Warren Buffett says, but it doesn't do a lot of things. It's not a company. It's not solving a problem. But I think we would argue that it does solve a problem. It does solve, purchasing power. It hedges inflation. It does those sort of things. Also, 45%. It's a $13.8 US dollar trillion a year market. And 45% of that is through demand in jewelry. So they also use it in semiconductors. And so gold is in the economy, it is moving. But also some of that jewelry is women in India who it's an investment as well. So what does drive the gold price? It's confidence in the financial systems. And that's plural. It's not just the U.S. economy, right? And look at Texas. Texas right now is looking to, come up with a currency based on gold. They're not alone. I could list them, several of them that are following suit. Some people do argue that we should base our global economy on gold. The U.S. dollar used to be pegged to gold, as you may know. And we unpegged it. Everyone unpegged it so they could pay for the war, right? So they could print money, in short. You can't print money if it's pegged to gold, right? Because you can't print gold. So we've unpegged it so that we can print all the money we want. And now they're wondering about, should we peg it to gold again? So there are a lot of things that factor into gold, but it is that confidence and stability of financial systems. The central banks around the world are buying up more gold now than they ever have in the history of gold. And I think that's saying something. People are starting to be more and more concerned. And if it's not this crisis that takes debt to a level that we can't recover, could be the next one or the one after that. So how many crises can we go through one after the other and still continue to print money? And circling back to talking about why I would own an organic farm that is unlisted versus listed, it's because of that short versus long-term, right? There is the short versus long-term fix to all of this as well. And it's complex. It's complex. It's a whole other conversation, I think. But
I was going to ask you a question, which is that, like, to invert it, like Charlie Munger would say. And so what would make you change your mind about gold? Like as an asset class, I guess.
Well, everybody's trying to mimic the scarcity of gold. If supply is limited, demand increases, the price goes up. It's pretty straight economics. All the gold on the earth today came through an asteroid, when an asteroid hit the earth. And if that would happen again and double the amount of gold on the earth, I'd change my mind in a heartbeat, for sure. So I don't mean to be flippant, but if I just think of all the fundamentals, gold's been around for 4,000 years and it's still doing its job. It is a defensive asset. It's not an offensive. It's not sexy. It's not. Some people would argue that it is, but really, I mean, it's like what people's father bought, right? Mm-hmm. There's sexier things too, but you can't risk your whole portfolio on sexy items, right? Sometimes you've just got to plant and build a foundation for your portfolio. And, gold has served that role for a long time. So other than another asteroid coming in to hit the planet, that's probably the biggest one I would flip pretty quickly.
Okay. I got a few more questions around that defensive part of a portfolio. In a previous interview, you said something like bonds are destroying capital, and you said there was like a double whammy effect here from some of this that we've seen in recent times. So can you unpack that for us?
Well, for the last 30 years, we've been in a deflationary environment, right? And so bonds have created value. The price of bonds have gone up. Now we're in a different market cycle. And none of us know what to do about it for a minute, right? We all needed to take a minute and think through this. Now we're in an inflationary environment. And so there's several models that we've been looking at and making decisions from over the last 30 years that now need to be rethought. And we have to go back further than 30 years to look for advice. And so what's happening now is the bond market, the prices, as inflation goes up, bond prices go down. So there is a double whammy, which I refer to, in that bond prices overall are going down in an inflationary environment. And at the same time, when the bond matures, it's worth less because your money is worth less. So if it matures at $100, that $100 is now worth $93 because of 7% inflation. And so in a 60-40 portfolio, you have 60% risk, 40% defensive assets, and typically bonds and cash. Now, for a lot of people, gold is coming in instead of maybe 5%, maybe they have a 10 or 15% allocation because just because of that nature of bonds not quite doing the job that it did for 30 years in the way that it did. And so gold is, replacing that defensible asset of bonds potentially for many.
I've got there's a couple more questions, but one of them is around crypto, which you mentioned before, is the blockchain and what have you. Some people listening to this would say, well, Jodi, isn't like Bitcoin the future of gold or something like this? And I don't know if it's the right question to ask, is like this or that, or maybe it's this and that. Like, how do you think about this?
I own both.
Yeah, right. Okay. Which I thought you might say, to be honest.
But I don't transact Bitcoin because I'm a minimalist. I care about the planet. That's just who I am. So for me, the electricity to do a Bitcoin transaction, haunts me. So I'm not a Bitcoin trader. But I bought Bitcoin years ago, and someday I'll sell it, But,
right. Yeah.
and hopefully I'll do all right.
So you basically took the best bit. What I think you're saying is you took the best bits of that to build Rush, like that concept.
We looked at the concept and said, why is this of interest? Take all the best bits from it, but there's no underlying value, right? I mean, Elon Musk can tweet and the value changes, right? So we know that. So there's no underlying value of Bitcoin per se. You could argue the same for gold, I suppose, but the volatility is the big difference, right? If everyone says, oh, they're going to change regulation, whereas gold, that's unlikely to ever happen because it's been around for so long and it's well entrenched in everyone's constitution, let alone property rights. I mean, Australia's ranked 4th in the world for property rights strength, if you will. And so that's one of the reasons we very deliberately set up here a gold company, right? In Australia. It's becoming more and more the right answer, by the way. And we're very happy to be here, even though it's a very, very small market for us. And we have a lot of work to do to take this offshore. But it's the right place to be domiciled for what we do. Bitcoin and gold are very, 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 very different in my mind. For me, they just occupy a very different place in my portfolio. Gold is defensive. It maintains my purchasing power. When I make money from crypto, if I did trade, I would put it more into gold. I need to park it somewhere, right? And we're working with a couple of pretty impressive decentralized finance professionals that we're working with the synthetics guys that really around the next big problem to solve. I'm going to take a little bit of a sidetrack here and get back to your question, but the really big thing to solve with blockchain in our industry is that proof of quality, quantity, and location, provenance, and to be able to prove that. Now, it's not as easy as it may sound. If you really think through that, that's a really hard thing to do because with a physical asset, you always have the centralized management of that physical asset. And you always have someone entering data into, if you're going to use blockchain, and so to date, we haven't used blockchain. We haven't needed it. We've stuck with the bank grade systems and regulation. But we do think there's an opportunity on the proof of location with blockchain. And we're very excited about the project we're doing with some of the former engineers of synthetics. And we're quite well progressed with that. And we think it's going to be game changing in our industry. We're very excited about it. But the reason why they came to us is because they did make profits in crypto and they need to park it. You can't keep risking all your money, as I said. So you have to be able to park it somewhere. And gold is a really good place to do that. So that's why we are gathering a lot of interest from the crypto community, because someday, you've got to have that balanced portfolio. Yeah. But it is very different. Bitcoin has very much mimicked the scarcity for sure. But gold is a physical asset. Crypto is not physical. Dogecoin, you can't point to me a Dogecoin. You can't use it. But I think, that ability to have utility, nobody spends Bitcoin, right? Because we've all heard the story of the guy who bought the pizza, and now that coin would have been worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And he spent a Bitcoin on pizza in the early days. And so you wouldn't spend your cleanest dirty shirt, right? If I had held Bitcoin and gold, which one would I spend first, right? So
the gold, I guess. Well, oh, sorry. Yes.
Depends.
Yeah, depends. Yeah.
Depends where you are in the market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking, you said you wouldn't transact your Bitcoin. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions for you, which is, how do you teach your kids about money?
First of all, they all need to be entrepreneurs, right? So my father, who spent 36 years in the same company, that doesn't happen anymore. Those days are gone. So the number one thing is that no one, I've taught my son, you can't wait for someone else to give you a job. Go create value in the world, right? And do so where at the end of the day, when you're at the finish line, you look back and you're proud of what you've done. You can stand up and look at that and say, yes, I added value to the globe. Speaking of balance sheets, right? Be an asset, not a liability. So I'm always pushing him to be on the asset side. So I think being an entrepreneur, he's got a couple businesses already. He's 12, so I think that's really important to teach that resourcefulness and curiosity of the world and problem solving. And I think with those skills that will go, be applicable to everything else that's in his portfolio when he has a proper portfolio. He owns gold for sure. But I think it's just about teaching him to budget and, the time value of money and not to not trust the financial system for sure, but always be able to question the system at any given time. Yeah.
I love that line about being an asset and not a liability. Yeah, that's really profound. Once it sounds like he's already wrapped his head around that, but once kids can wrap their head around that, even adults, it's a different ball game. Okay, so I've got one final question, and I'll have links in the show notes to everything Rush related, so people will be able to find everything. I know there's a lot of exciting developments, and we might even have you back on the show in time to talk about those. But my final question is, what's one thing about finance? It could be business, it could be life, it could be like investing, whatever. What's one thing that you believe that few people would agree with you on?
Oy, oy, oy. Like I mentioned, wisdom of crowds before. I think people forget to think for themselves. I think, when I was active as an angel investor, I used to get asked all the time to join deals, and I would ask, where's the due diligence package, or where's the deal room, or where's the summary that someone else did? And, there's 50 of us coming into this deal. We'll just jump in. We need a couple more. But they were doing it because their mates were doing it. I think people follow the crowd a lot. And I think, AI scares me because I think the ability to create fake news moving forward and move markets en masse, I think is horrifying. And so I think people have to continue to think for themselves and get their knowledge from good places. Now, but having said that, I wouldn't stand alone in saying that. I'm sure there's many other people who feel that way. So I'm not quite sure if there's anything that I would really be up against the crowds on. But I think I just get frustrated when people don't think for themselves. I think it's easy. Right. It's easy to take the easy way out all the time in life. And I think we all need to think for ourselves.
I think this conversation is going to go down for me as something where it's important to stress test not just your own assumptions, but others' assumptions as well. And it's something that I do in my everyday life, is just focus on incentives, spend most of my time focused on incentives, whether it's of people, individuals, or organizations. And I don't think enough people are critical in a good way of the things around them. And they just accept the status quo.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. This has been really, really interesting to me, Jodi. And if I just go back to the beginning of the conversation, tracing like your early journey and the pathway you took and how those influences have later shaped. So you're already entrepreneurial, how those influences have shaped what you've created today. I can see that thread, and it's really, really impressive. And so thank you for taking time to come across Sydney here and join me in our meeting room, makeshift studio today. I really appreciate your time.
Great, Owen. It's been a great podcast. I've been listening to it for a while, so I'm glad to be a part of it. Appreciate your time. Thank you.